This episode of Paradigm Profiles is called Die, Snitch, or Debrief. The engineers, the architects, and the creators of Pelican Bay State Prison all had a common goal when they designed the blueprints to this high-security supermax prison on the coast of the Oregon border. The general consensus was to construct a maximum security prison with conditions that were so deplorable, so inhumane, and so atrocious that it would break the majority of its future residents and cause irreparable damage to the human psyche. Men would be confined in an environment that would literally strip them of their human dignity and cause them to question their own sanity. In 1991, I was validated as a member of the Nuestra Raza, or the NR. At the time, the California Department of Corrections classified it as one of many disruptive groups. When I was validated at this time, it preceded all the future revisions that were made to a validation process that was considered broken and plagued with duplicity. The first set of revisions made to the validation process came in 1994 after an inmate named Stephen Castillo challenged the constitutionality and veracity of the gang validation procedures. Castillo contended a litany of issues that also included the three-pronged approach that California was using to validate alleged gang members and the truth balancing test that gang intel officers were relying on. Prior to Castillo prevailing on this writ of habeas corpus, the validation process was a complete sham. All they needed in order to validate you and throw you in the shoe under an indeterminate term was three prongs, or three elements. It was as easy as a picture, a statement made by a confidential informant, and a tattoo. Gang intel officers all over California weaponized this process and began using it to their advantage. If they wanted to get you off the main line, all they had to do was fabricate the evidence under the pretenses that you were a threat to the safety and security of the institution and you were gone. It was as simple as that. Understandably, to a lot of guys who were getting railroaded and pipelined straight to the shoe behind bogus or unfounded information, this was not only distressing, but it also had grave consequences on how they did their time, how their prison credits were calculated, and just their freedom to move around. Even worse, if you had a life tail and you ended up in the shoe, this would continue to have adverse effects on the parole board hearings whenever they would come up for parole consideration. I can attest to the fact that I was rightfully identified and I got validated as a result of the things I personally got involved in, but a lot of the other guys weren't so lucky. Confidential informants either provided false information, somebody just wanted them off the yard, or it was just assumed they were clicked up because of who they associated with. I'd say that probably more than half the guys that got validated back in the 90s weren't even bona fide gang members. Doing time in solitary confinement was something I quickly acclimated myself to, and it really didn't bother me to do time like this. Over the years, it was just something I got used to. I've said this before in some of my other descriptions about Pelican Bay and the shoe environment, but for the purpose of putting this in perspective, I'm going to emphasize on some of this again. Imagine being in an environment where tension always runs high and animosity is a normal part of life back there. Prison is full of men who have reached a critical crossroad in their lives. They've had their families taken away from them, their freedom's been stripped, and for some, this is how they're going to spend the rest of their lives. That's a tough reality to accept, that the other world that you came to know out there no longer exists. That's how you have to embrace it. You have to come to terms and peace with the fact that you're never again going to see things like trees, grass, a beach, that you'll never have the luxury of cooking a home-cooked meal, that you'll never be able to walk into a grocery store and buy groceries, or just do some of the everyday things that we all take for granted. I spent all the 90s in the shoe, and all the way up until 2012, this was how I did my time, locked in these types of lockdown environments. Most of the time I spent back there, I spent by myself, and this was by design. I could have had a cellie at times, but one of the things I started to learn about myself was that I did time better by myself. In order to get along with someone back there, you really had to be compatible, and you just had to find someone who you really got along with. I know some of you who have done shoe time can relate to what I'm saying. How many times did you and your cellie come within seconds of throwing blows? How many times did you tell each other, fuck it, we're both gonna get deemed, but I'm to the point where I don't even care anymore? How many sit downs did you guys have in an effort of alleviating the problem and talking it out? Don't put the soap there. Wipe out the sink when you're done using it. Don't spit in the sink. Don't step on my bed when you're getting up on your bunk. The spoonful of coffees you're using is too much. It's gotta last us all month. Stop breathing. You can't shit more than one time a day. I don't want to keep smelling your ass, etc., etc. It's easy to get irritated and frustrated in those cells. You almost start to look for a reason to pick a fight with your cellie. Prior to going to the SHU for the first time back in 1992, I basically already had acquired a lot of schooling and had become a polished NR member. I understood the politics, I took notice of how things worked, and the ADSEG in Susanville basically became my training grounds. During the time I was there, I picked up 4 DA referrals, multiple physical altercations, and 3 stabbings. I was young, I was eager to earn my bones, and Susanville was fertile ground for this type of training. This kept me there for close to 2 years until I would finally max out and parole on June 6, 1992. By this time, I had seen a lot of ends either lock it up, get themselves in hot water, or they just got tired and checked out. Sometime in the 90s, after I was validated and started spending all my time in the SHU, I became more versed in criminal law and really started delving deep into the law books. I gained more of an in-depth understanding of how the SHU was being used as a weapon by CDC and just how this was having a detrimental effect on some of the lifers. Getting out of the SHU at that time looked almost impossible. It looked bleak, and the possibility of getting the validation process revised just seemed to be too far out of reach. I met a lot of good ends back there in the SHU. Dudes who I considered to be solid and dudes who were back there for handling their business out on the main lines. A lot of these ends were just regular northerners, but because they had participated in a stabbing or a removal and were said to be associated with either the NR or the NF, they ended up getting validated. Aside from the internal problems that we were already experiencing with the NR and some of the members who were using their influence to poison the minds of the other members, I began to take notice of a lot of ends who just started locking it up and walking away. It almost became commonplace to hear about someone else who locked it up or who fell into bad standings. And this was happening everywhere, in all the prisons. You not only hear about individuals who laid it down or who got discouraged and walked away, but then you'd also begin hearing stories about 5, 10, or even 15 northerners locking it up and checking out in one main line. And this was all being done under the assumption that something was falling wayside at the leadership level, the upper echelon. I remember when I first went to the hole in San Quentin back in 1990, there was probably only 1 or 2 DOs in the entire block. DOs were scarce back then, and they were far and few from those who remained active. But when I started seeing whole blocks and whole units of guys in special program or PCs in San Quentin who were a thriving and booming population, I knew it had to have something to do with the way leadership was leading the masses. Norteño started getting strong-armed by rogue NR members, and then the NF also played an intricate role in this as well when Cuete drafted up El Norte Law. This was a power play that just resulted in pushing a lot of people out. Every time I went back to the SHU in Pelican Bay, the BNL grew expeditiously and more Bs and Cs began locking it up. Like I said, the SHU became unbearable to a lot of dudes who were back there and who began to think that they would never make it out of that environment. If you allowed any weakness to set in, whether it was the fact that you were a lifer and wanted to have contact visits with your loved ones again, whether you were a lifer and realized that being in the SHU almost guaranteed that you'd never make parole, or whether it was something else that motivated you, such as your wife, kids, or any other vulnerability, if you allowed it to weigh too heavily on your mind, it would eventually get the best of you. I seen a lot of guys lock it up and take that walk of shame. Dudes who I thought were strong-minded individuals, guys who I never expected to go that route. But then again, doesn't it always happen like that? From San Quentin to Pelican Bay, I seen them lock it up in a number of different ways. But guys who had become resigned to locking it up in Pelican Bay always had a different way of doing it. I seen very few dudes just say fuck it and walk straight out the pod in front of everyone. Instead, they always had an underhanded way of doing it so that they wouldn't be seen dishonoring themselves. This is the way they would usually do it. Obviously, this was something that they had been planning for the last couple of days, weeks, or possibly even months, because they put in a request to either go to medical, dental, or the law library. Under normal circumstances, This wouldn't draw any suspicion because these were places guys went to all the time. So once they put in this request, they usually would get called out sometime later that week or sometime within a few days. When the time finally came for them to go, they'd walk out into the pod and go through the normal routine just like anyone else. They'd send their acknowledgments to everyone and then they leave. At this point, there was nothing to be suspicious about. But hours would eventually pass and then we'd figure out that another one bit the dust. Or sometimes the floor officer would walk into the pod pushing a property cart and holding some empty garbage bags to pack up this guy's property. The officer wouldn't say anything, but the look on his face said it all. If he had a cellie, the floor officer would come in and say, "Hey man, your cellie isn't coming back. Can you pack up his property?" At that point, there wouldn't even be any point in asking as we already knew what time it was. And if his cellie did the honors of packing up his shit, it was almost guaranteed that half his property would be kept by a cellie. In fact, for those who were smart and anticipated this, they'd figure out a way to be sneaky about it by packing up their own shit while their cellie was on the yard, and then they would leave before he came back in. And of course, this would all be coordinated ahead of time by slipping the floor officer a kite, telling him what their intentions were so that there was no way their cellie would be let back in before they slid out that front gate. After seeing this happen so many times in the same pod, we eventually started joking with each other when someone would get called out for either a legitimate medical concern, to the dentist, or a visit. "Hey homie, it was a pleasure meeting you." This was all said in good humor, but that's how bad it got. From whatever unit they were housed in, they would then be walked over to C12, which was the THU, Transitional Housing Unit, or PC, Punk City. I never debriefed in CDC and never walked in S&Y yard, but I heard enough stories about the process to know what happens and how it works. So before this last class action lawsuit was granted, there was only one of three ways to get yourself extracted out of the SHU. You either died, you debriefed, or you paroled. It was as simple as that, and this was something you were told during your welcoming speech. Unless they somehow got themselves in hot water, the majority of the guys who I had seen lock it up were guys who had been back there in the SHU for years and had just gotten discouraged. Most of them were lifers as they had the most to lose, but then again, there was also a lot of other guys who just wanted to go back out to the main line. The thought of never getting out of the SHU just became too much for a lot of these dudes. So a lot of them began locking it up, never anticipating that someday 2 AB members would file a class action lawsuit that would change everything. I'm sure that a lot of those guys who went that route were probably kicking themselves in the ass when the floodgates were opened, and that they probably wished they had just stuck it out for just a little bit longer, but nobody thought this would happen. So when these guys were taken to the THU and C12, this is when the debriefing process would commence. They would be told to literally write a bio, a book about themselves, exposing anyone and everyone who was involved in whatever criminal organization they belonged to. They wanted everything, no rocks left unturned, and they wanted details. Whoever was involved in criminal activity, who was involved in stabbings, who was involved in murders, who recruited you, who sponsored you, etc., etc. If they had any inkling whatsoever that you were holding back or cherry picking what information you were choosing to divulge, they made you start all over again. This is something they had to do because they had to make sure that anyone who went through this process was not only being forthright, but they also had to make sure that this individual was being authentic. And although there might have been some dudes that might have tried to slip through, the gang intel officers that conducted these hearings were just way too savvy to fall for the okie doke. This was to ensure that no sleepers ever tried to slip through the cracks and infiltrate the S&Y yards. Now I'm just gonna put it this way. For the most part, I try to steer clear from being judgmental about other people and whatever struggles they've had to endure personally. But I'll tell you where that area becomes a little muddy. You have a lot of guys who, for whatever reason, are no longer part of that lifestyle. Either they locked it up, they got tired, they got weak, they didn't want to handle their business, they got blasted, or they got themselves in a wreck. Whatever happened, they're no longer active. But some of these same dudes that debrief and who go through that process try to lie and candy coat what they did or said. They either tell other people that they didn't have any information because they didn't know nothing, or they said that they just exposed things that these intel officers already knew, or they just denied going through the debriefing process altogether. This is all done in an effort to keep that skeleton in the closet because they don't want people to know what they really did. I guess we're to believe that seasoned gang intel officers are gonna let somebody skate on through because he either didn't know anything or he just wasn't affiliated. Horse feathers. This was something I could never understand. Why some of these dudes can't just fess up like a man and be upfront about what they did. And it's all done at the behest of leading other people to believe that they still maintain some semblance of honor. That they're not a rat and that they didn't snitch. And trust me, there's a lot of these types of cats, not only on the S&Y yards, but in the prisons and on the streets as well. They're everywhere. I've personally ran into a lot of these dudes that have debriefed, and it's comical how far they'll try to go to convince everyone else around them that when they went through that debriefing process, that they only told on themselves, that they only exposed things that they were personally involved in, or they'll say they didn't say anything about anyone else. Come on, that don't even make sense. It's almost like they forget that some of us who have done time and who know better know damn well that that's not the way it works. Anyone who says they debriefed and that they only told on themselves during these interviews is a stone-faced liar. I'll tell you like this, the debriefing requirements consisted of a strict set of policies that were stringent, uncompromising, and inflexible. And they told you up front what these ground rules were. They wanted to know everything. Who recruited you? Who sponsored you? Who else was part of that gang? What crimes were committed? Who was assaulted? How the leadership was set up? Who the leadership consisted of? And everything you did while you were part of that gang. They wanted details. This was something they gave no ground on either. It was either all or nothing. In fact, before they had you go in to do the actual physical interview where you were questioned and interrogated by 2 or 3 gang intel officers, the first thing they had you do was to write out a complete bio about yourself, your life, how you got involved with gangs, and then they wanted you to give a very detailed description about everything you and the gang were involved in. Dates, times, how you were recruited, etc., etc. If your bio didn't meet the requirements and it looked like you were cutting corners and weren't giving them everything they wanted, they give it back and tell you to start all over. Trust me, there was a lot of dudes who tried to get through the debriefing process by giving up the least bit of information as possible, and they would try to pick and choose what they were going to expose. But you know what happened to these cats? They'd send them right back to the end of the line and tell them to come back when they were serious about giving it up. They had to. Otherwise, there would have been too many sleepers slipping through the cracks so that they could go out to one of these S&Ys and whack a real deal. So the next time you hear one of these guys that's been on an S&Y say he only told on himself, or that he didn't talk about anyone else, or any of this other malarkey, you know he's lying. If he went through a debrief and hit an S&Y, he provided hurtful and critical information and he snitched on whoever it was that he was affiliated with. And that info does have an adverse effect on people. It goes right into their C-files. Every time someone provided info on me during a debrief, they updated my 812 gang file and it kept me current. I know because I had a lot of people provide information against me in their debriefs. So all these guys who claim that they only talked about themselves, how would this even be possible? It even defies logic. They must think that the rest of us are stupid or oblivious to how this stuff works. In order for that to fly, they'd have to find a squad of gangtail officers stupid enough to believe that they recruited themselves, that they sponsored themselves into the gang, that they got involved with criminal activity by themselves, and that everybody else was nameless and faceless. That's like someone saying, I went in and testified, but I only testified against myself. I didn't say nothing about anyone else. Listen, aside from what I'm exposing to you guys, there's a former P9 member named Powder who gives a pretty accurate and thorough description of what the debriefing process entails on that channel Flacco used to do interviews on. I think it's called Stories Told by a Current Prisoner, and I think the name of the episode is called Split Within the Brotherhood. Check that episode out as it coincides with what I've talked about and anything else that I might have missed. Someone else who has a solid perspective on this is Flacco from a convict's perspective. He's never debriefed, but he's well aware of how this process works. The next time you guys catch him on one of his lives, ask him what the debriefing process requires and whether or not someone could slip through it without snitching on other people. I'm sure he'll tell you that in order for you to even qualify to be considered to be put on the list, you have to provide information on other people so they know you're not just trying to dummy up and slip through. I understand that falling into bad standings and that having to compromise your integrity can be an ego crusher. Trust me, I get it. And I also know it can kill some people's pride. I think this is something that almost anybody can understand. But lying about it or trying to turn yourself into a chameleon to make yourself look like you're a cut above the rest won't make it go away. Denial can only take you so far. When someone is no longer a part of that lifestyle, regardless of what ended their career or how it ended, they should just stay away from passing judgment on other people or trying to make themselves look like they're better than anyone else. That's the last thing they should be doing. Because technically, someone that's walked in SNY has no business speaking on anyone else or trying to make themselves look like they still have some integrity. If I walked a yard with child molesters, rapists, weirdos, and all kinds of other trash, I definitely wouldn't feel like I had any grounds to be critical about anyone else. But this is even something else that I've even heard some of these cats deny. Their last stand, their very last leg that they'll try to stand on, is that they'll say, I was on an SNY yard, but there weren't no chomos, rapists, and weirdos out there. We got them all off the yard. At this point, it just becomes laughable. Well, that's definitely not true, and some of us are smarter than that. But it's all part of the big act that people put on because they're trying to save face. I'm still solid. I'm still embraced by my hood. Active cats still fuck with me because I ain't no snitch. And I'm just that swell of a guy. I just do my own thing now, etc., etc. It's all done for the purpose of separating themselves and to show some level of detachment. It's almost like they're operating under some type of delusional category system for dropouts or something. You got the bad, then you got the worst, and then you got the absolute worst of the worst. Come on, man. At the end of the day, it's all bad business. I guess this stuff flies if you're green and you don't know any better, but sometimes I think people just don't want to believe it. There's only one problem with tunnel vision. It stops you from seeing reality and it stops you from seeing the bigger picture. The lesson in all this, you guys, is that some of us that speak transparency know and practice the real definition of transparency. We've come to accept the circumstances that we've created for ourselves, and we own it. No gimmicks, no games, no facades, no bullshit. But most dudes in this position can't say the same. So just be wary of these types of cats when you run across them. And this ain't directed at anyone in particular. It's not any shade, and it's not even about that. This is just to take the blinders off of some of you, just so you can be aware of it, and just so you know some of the games these types of dudes play. They're all over the SNYs, the jails, the penitentiaries, and the streets. Anyways, we've now reached the point in this episode where you guys are actually going to get to see the debriefing process as it's working. This is an exclusive video of a never before seen interview during the debriefing. This was just one of many interviews for this inmate. This isn't anything off of lockup or a documentary that you're going to find on the National Geographic channel. This is a real exclusive video. In fact, I was in C11 with this former Crip named Bobo from Fresno, a Hoover Crip. The interesting thing about this interview is that Bobo talks about the CCO's Constitutional Crip organization, who a lot of people believe were now defunct. During the course of a debriefing process, inmates will get pulled out to take part in these secret squirrel type of meetings with the institution's SSU officers. It could take 5 of these meetings or it could take 25 of these meetings. It just depends on when the officers feel like they've extracted all the information they want out of you. But if you notice by the exchange of questions and answers, these debriefs are also serving another purpose. Aside from debriefing Bobo, they're also educating themselves and are asking questions that's beneficial to them as intel officers. In closing this up, it's now widely known that the policy of die, debrief, or parole is no longer a policy that's in effect. Gang members who are affiliated or who end up back in the shoe no longer have to worry about catching an indie tournament shoe or spending the rest of their lives in those types of long-term maximum security housing units. So the days of selling your soul to the devil just to drink a cold soda or eat bubble gum and ice cream are finally a figment of the past. I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode of Paradigm Profiles. Our next project should be dropping later this week. I'm talking real fast because I'm trying to get this last episode out by tonight. And for those of you who were under the assumption that the CCOs were no longer active, you might want to pay attention to the ensuing video.
We talked earlier, you said when you came to prison, you were president of the CRIP. What did you actually evolve into? Did you join another organization?
Yes.
And what would that be?
The NCO, Blue Crip, Blue No Crip organization.
Colonel, what would you say to someone in law enforcement that would believe that the Blue No Crips don't exist? What would you say to that individual?
The B is, in most cases, when you see anything structured, especially against the administration, or wars that's structured, more than likely Blue Nose are behind it because they have that level of intellect to push something like that.
So, but the Blue No Crips do exist.
It does exist.
And you held, what was your highest rank in the Blue No Crips?
Captain.
So let's take it. So as a Hoover, you were recruited to the BNCO and you became a soldier.
Yes.
And what was your next rank after that?
Sergeant.
And what were your responsibilities as a sergeant?
To train people in weaponry, to train people in war tactics, and to train people in overall information as far as the basis of what they need to know to survive and the things they need to be aware of.
So you were training?
Yes.
As a lieutenant, did you promote to lieutenant, I guess?
Yes.
What was your duties then?
To be an enforcer and a recruiter. Those who I've seen and I felt and exactly who's who. I'm talking about other ethnicities.
What would you say? There's Blue Nose in every main line? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
You think there's Blue Nose in every
No
main
doubt.
line?
What about on the streets?
Yes.
They function on the streets as well?
But mostly they function on the streets, Raymond Crips. Because those are the ones that actually started BNCO, was evil and threats, and then they took the idea that took he was, one of the main figures in prison, is Blue Nose.
Mm-hmm. What about identifiers? Do you use a tattoo? Do you use a symbol?
Yeah, I have a tattoo of BNCO on me.
So this is, you've been through a lot of training. Again, tell me, what was some of the books that you've read while you've been in prison that helped you?
I read war books mostly.
And
I'm real fascinated with wars.
But BNCO, is this kind of something they want you to teach?
Well, not necessarily. It's just kind of like, yeah, they have you teach like war tactics so you can understand different diversities of war, different things of this nature. So I read like Art of War, I read Dialectical Materialism, Unseen Hand, Jubilee by Nat Turner. I read books on World War I, World War II, World War, Korean War, Revolutionary War.
And then you also read books by George Johnson.
Yes, Blood in My Eyes, Solid Air Brothers.
And why did you read those books?
Well, I read them because they was not only available, but because of I was advised that it would just be wise to, I'm talking when I first got to prison, just to check this guy out, to see what he's really about.
Let me answer this, Colonel. What is the goal of the BNCO? If they're out there and they're functioning, they have the strength, they have the structure, and they have these 20 principles to live by, what is their goal?
Well, our ultimate goal was supposed to be is to elevate to a corporate type level.
So what's the goal inside a prison? What do you think the BNCO wants to do?
Well, that's the original goal. I mean, when it was brought to my attention, the original goal was for us to go beyond a street level.
Saying that if there's a BNCO member on a main line, his job is to instill a belief system, an ideology, and a way that Crips are supposed to function on that main line.
Exactly.
And that philosophy,
Whether he do it indirectly or directly,
he's going to do it.
he's going to do it.
So as you, who are the enemies of the BNCO? Let me ask you that.
Our number one enemy is the administration.
Which would mean
Anything
law
that's trickled
enforcement?
down, yes. Anything that's trickled down, I mean, from the White House all the way to CO. Anytime someone has the power to oppress you, or to take your freedom, or to put you on death row, or to sentence you to life, or to abuse you, like you see Rodney King type incidents and everything, or abuse of authority, that's who your enemy is, because they have the power. They use their governments, their systems, their institutes to quell you or to hinder you. Therefore, that's your enemy. And the only way sometimes you can fight back is by letting your presence be known. As a man, I'm not going to tolerate that. Even if you have to die in the process of letting them be known, hey, I'm a man.
So when you talk about assaults of staff, so is it uncommon for the BNCO to authorize or actually even promote staff assaults?
Yes, a killer mentality. They tell you that. There's nothing wrong with killing, but kill necessarily instead of out of foolishness. So it's like we was taught we still need those to kill when necessary, but we're not going to start killing just because of a rag or because of a block, because of anything like that. We're going to start killing because of what's being done to us that we feel is unjust. So if someone is trying to quell you because you're trying to move forward, they're wrong. So this is like, for instance, you see a lot of organizations in prison that's trying to build. The administration or IGI or whatever are trying to quell that because they feel maybe what we're doing, you're going to pay the consequences for that. Because we feel that's unjust. Now, if we're doing anything towards you, then we can understand you doing what you're doing toward us. But if you look at the institution, you have to set a precedent so people can see how things are supposed to go. And then it's up to them to learn from that and to try to follow that pattern.
Okay, so
So you're setting an example.
setting an example.
That's why I said I would use like a form of exemplification or setting an example for president.
Setting an example of unity.
Yes.
And so other Crips will follow along. You guys think, so it's.
But they have to be able to see that.
See, so you guys organized and unified and come together. Now, would you say that, how many BNCO members would you think there are in existence?
Right now,
Yeah.
I would probably say at least 500.
Think that many?
I would think so.
And with that many, is it to go with the BNCO then to kind of bring Crips under their control and just kind of keep everyone together? Even if they don't want to become a BNCO member, still, so there's no friction amongst Crips, because you said that Crips go in the street, but when they come to the joint, the kind of goal is to stop that and let's all just be Crips.
Yes.
Yeah. And then the BNCO would be the higher entity.
Yes.
The hierarchy would be above just regular Crips.
That's basically the goal, but we've been still trying to do that for over 20 years, but it's difficult because of
What do
so
you
many
think
different dynamics that
So
we have.
percentage, are you 35% there out of 100? Are you 85%?
Right now, in this day and age, we're probably about 25%. Not necessarily in numbers, but strength and unification. So you don't have to be strong in numbers as long as you're strong in unification, because unification is bigger than what it appears to be. Unification also deals with just having an understanding. Just so like, for instance, like the BGFs and so forth. Outside of wars and stuff going on, they doing what they do. We doing what we do. But a lot of times wars are brought about or come into existence. We understand the importance of being unified at that time. You see my point?
So you think there's nice communication now between the BNCO and the BGF, would you say?
Between certain individuals. See, I always try to keep that with them, and other individuals have, but see, that's what I was saying.
But you said you received a lot of training from BGF members.
Yes. So see, most people are so young. Most of them is young. You have some.
But the upper older guys, would you say, would think that's a good thing to have as a line of communication with the BGF?
Yes.
Not so much every soldier. Not every BNCO is going to have that, but the upper echelon guys will?
Yes.
Okay. So that you guys can work together and then that, if anything needs to be trickled down, it will trickle down from the higher ranking guys.
Exactly.
Down and then that.
Because I've always tried to keep it with the BGS. Always did.
And one of the things we discussed earlier was you said on recruitment for the BNCO, is a lot of times they look at who's the most respected person from a specific set, and they'll try and target him for recruitment simply based on the fact that they know that this individual's put in work and he's respected in his clique.
That shows that he's sincere.
He would be good for our organization.
Yeah,
So that's
so
what
he's
we're
sincere
targeting.
about what he's representing. So if he's sincere with that, and if he see a need for this, he'll be sincere with this as well.
So homies, if he becomes a BNCO, so let's say it's 8 trays, for example.
Okay.
So you're on the main line and there's an 8 tray, and you think he has the mentality to be a BNCO,
Okay.
he's respected by his own people.
Okay.
Would you recruit him?
Yes.
What is the benefit of recruiting that guy?
The benefit of recruitment because he can contribute in various ways because he can use that same influence. He can use his same ability, I guess you say natural abilities to draw people toward him. Some people just have that aura about themselves and people that can be useful to us. Whether it's they might be good at bringing people in or whether they be good at organizing or whatever traits that we can see in them.
So if you brought that one guy that's one 8 tray in, would he then be able to control his homies that are there?
Yeah, see, that's what we like. We like that.
Why do you like that?
Because what it does is it alleviates the wildness, so to speak. You see what I'm saying? Because he still is going to carry that weight amongst his homies. He's still going to carry that weight. You see what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, if he's a BNCO, we're all instructed to control our homies from our neighborhood, whether they are BCOs or not. That's why in most cases, if you see a reputable BNCO in a yard, you're going to see his homies going to be tight. You know what I'm saying? Militant, Crips, soldiers, whatever. You know what I mean? Because he's going to make sure of that because it's a reflection of him. So you got to remember, as being a reputable or a certain figure type member from your clique or your hood, your homies is a reflection of you. So if your homies running around appearing to be weak or running around acting all ignorant, then that says like, damn, what did they say about the big homie? You know what I mean? He ain't controlling them, he don't have no influence over them. See, that goes back to the original question. The reason why they see that is because they see that you already have that. They see that you already have that amongst your homies. And so they say, okay, he has the ability for youngsters to cling to him. We can use that because the same influence that he have in that regard can be used in this regard. They might rechannel it a little bit, but it can still be useful.
So you get the one guy, but pretty much you get the soldiers that fall underneath him without having to deal with them.
Yeah.
He deals with that particular group, but he's a part of the overall
Yes.
organization.
Exactly.
Okay.